In 1969, a sound named reggae quietly rewrote history, but most people misunderstand how it truly happened. This video uncovers the overlooked songs, risky decisions, and unexpected moments that gave reggae its voice. Stay to the end to see how humor, faith, scandal, and experimentation fused into a genre that reshaped global music in ways still misunderstood today. The rhythm hardened before anyone agreed on what to call it. A low-slung pulse dragging itself out of Kingston yards and zinc-fenced lanes, heavier than ska, slower than rocksteady, built for bodies that had learned patience the hard way. Jamaica was no longer newly free, yet freedom had not arrived with the fullness people imagined. And that contradiction lived inside the music, pressing against the bass lines as if sound itself were arguing with history. Long before the words settled into mouths overseas, singers, musicians, producers, and dancers already knew something had changed. That the beat now walked instead of skipped. That the offbeat chop felt like breath held and released under pressure. In that unsettled space, Frederick Toots Hibbert stepped into a studio and did something deceptively simple. He sang the word that would travel further than any manifesto, repeating it until it stuck to the rhythm like a brand burned into memory. When that voice declared the name, reggae stopped being a rumor and became an identity, not invented in theory, but claimed in sound, fixed forever on tape while the rest of the world was still catching up. Even as that name took shape, another voice was already crossing the water, carrying the weight of Kingston's working-class scripture into places that had never heard Jamaican patois spoken with pride on record. Desmond Dekker did not ask permission from radio programmers or foreign audiences when he sang about suffering, faith, and survival. He simply told the truth as he knew it, and the truth turned out to be exportable. When that song reached Britain, and then the United States, it did not arrive as novelty. It arrived as revelation. For listeners who had never felt the heat of a Kingston afternoon or the press of poverty in a colonial hangover, the rhythm still made sense, because the story underneath it was older than geography. That moment marked the point where reggae stopped being a local solution to local pain and became a language capable of explaining itself anywhere. Yet reggae's early power was never limited to prophecy or uplift alone. It thrived equally on gossip, humor, and the strange poetry of everyday tragedy. A racehorse collapsed mid-run, and the story traveled faster than fact, mutating into song almost immediately. When the pioneers turned that incident into music, they revealed something essential about the genre's DNA. Nothing was too small, too absurd, or too human to be carried by the rhythm. In dance halls, laughter mixed with shock as people sang along, recognizing their own way of storytelling in the performance. When that same record crossed into Britain through pressing plants and immigrant suitcases, it proved that reggae did not need translation. It needed only time on a turntable and a crowd willing to listen. Hope entered the sound almost casually, without sermon or spectacle, carried by a voice smoother than most, but no less rooted in struggle. Jimmy Cliff sang about peace, not as a fantasy, but as a necessity, threading optimism through a beat that refused to rush. That balance made his music accessible without emptying it of meaning. And when his songs climbed charts abroad, they prepared the ground for something larger. Years later, cinema would freeze his image as reggae's international face, but the groundwork had already been laid in these earlier recordings where melody and message learned how to coexist without canceling each other out. Not all of reggae's first declarations were polite, and the music showed early that it would not submit to respectability politics. Max Romeo learned this lesson publicly when a song dripping with innuendo ran headlong into censorship. The band was supposed to silence it. Instead, it amplified the record's reach, turning scandal into currency. The episode exposed the truth reggae would keep returning to. Restriction only sharpened its appeal. What offended gatekeepers thrilled audiences, and the charts reflected that reversal of power. The genre was learning quickly that it could survive disapproval and even thrive on it. While singers argued morality in public, a quieter revolution was taking place behind studio glass, where sound itself was being pulled apart and reassembled. Lee Scratch Perry approached recording not as documentation, but as experimentation, treating the mixing board like an instrument with a temperament of its own. Instrumentals emerged that felt cinematic, haunted by echoes and negative space, their bass lines stretching like shadows at dusk. These records hinted at futures no one had named yet, where producers would stand alongside singers as authors, and the studio would become a site of invention rather than reproduction. That same tension between old forms and new pulse played out among harmony groups who had made their names in the previous era. The Paragons did not abandon elegance when the rhythm shifted. Instead, they carried it forward, proving that reggae could inherit sophistication without becoming stiff. Their voices floated over the new beat, confirming continuity, where outsiders expected rupture. The music did not erase its past, it absorbed it, folding earlier styles into a deeper, heavier present. Spiritual longing entered reggae, not as metaphor, but as declaration, voiced through scripture carried into melody. When the Melodians sang of exile and Zion, they were not borrowing imagery, they were affirming belief. Drawing directly from sacred texts, the song transformed ancient lament into modern testimony, announcing that reggae could function as prayer without losing its footing on the dance floor. That balance between the sacred and the social became one of the genre's defining tensions, echoed in countless recordings that followed. Across the Atlantic, Jamaican migration reshaped British cities, and reggae adapted again, this time to colder weather and different streets. Danny Livingstone recorded playful, self-aware tracks that acknowledged reggae's movement across borders, songs that sounded both proud and amused at their own hybridity. These records marked the moment when reggae stopped being solely Jamaican in geography while remaining Jamaican in spirit, embedding itself into British youth culture in ways that would later explode through revival movements. Instrumentals found unexpected homes as well, their hypnotic grooves escaping clubs and entering public ritual. When organ lines and rolling bass became fixtures in football stadiums, reggae demonstrated its ability to dissolve boundaries between entertainment and everyday life. The music no longer belonged exclusively to records or dance halls. It lived in crowds, chants, and shared moments, absorbed into the texture of communal experience. Even as reggae spread outward, deeper currents were gathering beneath the surface, carrying theology and resistance in equal measure. Early performances of chants rooted in Rastafarian belief circulated quietly before becoming cornerstones of roots reggae. Groups like the Abyssinians began introducing language and ideas drawn from Ethiopian scripture, embedding them in melodies that refuse simplification. These songs asked listeners not just to dance, but to reckon, to consider history, exile, and redemption as lived realities rather than abstract concepts. Covers, too, became acts of translation rather than imitation. When Bob Andy and Marcia Griffiths reinterpreted a civil rights anthem through reggae's lens, they forged a bridge between African American struggle and Caribbean experience. The song did not lose its original power. It gained another dimension, speaking directly to West Indian youth navigating racial tension abroad. In doing so, reggae proved it could converse with global Black history without surrendering its accent. What tied these moments together was not uniformity of message or sound, but a shared insistence on truth, as lived rather than polished. Reggae's early architects did not coordinate a movement. They responded to circumstances, each in their own way, trusting the rhythm to hold their differences together. Producers pushed equipment beyond intended limits. Singers tested lyrical boundaries. Harmony groups adapted without apology. And audiences responded with bodies first, analysis later. By the time the world began to recognize reggae as a genre rather than an anomaly, its foundations were already layered with contradiction. Joy threaded through hardship, humor alongside prophecy. The music refused singular definition because the lives that shaped it were never singular. It carried the sound of a nation arguing with itself, negotiating freedom in real time, translating survival into groove. Long before stadiums filled and films canonized its heroes, reggae had already done its most radical work, teaching people to move differently, to listen differently, to hear their own stories echoed back at them with bass heavy enough to feel like grounding. In that sense, the music did not announce change so much as embody it, walking forward at its own pace, unconcerned with approval, certain only of its need to exist. You have just heard the story of how reggae found its voice, but history lives in interpretation. Which song here do you believe carried the deepest impact? Which artist best captured the tension of that moment? Do you hear continuity or rebellion when you listen back? Drop your thoughts in the comments and keep the discussion alive. Follow for more deep dives into music, history, and culture.